The last time Margaret Ellison walked through the front door of Havelock House, she was 81 years old. The house had been empty for 3 years, and every room she entered felt like opening a letter written by someone she used to be. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Her daughter Claire had driven her there, 3 hours from the care home in Bristol where Margaret now lived, navigating the Norfolk lanes with the careful attention of someone who understood that this journey mattered in ways that couldn't be fully articulated. They'd barely spoken during the drive, not from any tension between them, but from a shared understanding that some silences are more eloquent than conversation, that approaching something significant sometimes requires quiet preparation. Havelock House sat at the end of a private lane that wound through fields still used for farming, though the farm itself had been sold separately when the estate was broken up in 2019. The house was a substantial Victorian structure, not grand but generous in its proportions, built in 1887 by Margaret's great-grandfather from money made in the wool trade. It had cream-painted render over brick, tall sash windows that Margaret's mother had always complained about for the drafts they admitted in winter, and a slate roof that had been replaced twice in the years she could remember. The estate agent had suggested this visit, actually. The house was under offer. A young family from London had expressed serious interest in purchasing it, subject to surveys and various legal processes that would take several weeks. Before the sale was finalized, before Havelock House passed permanently out of the family's ownership, the estate agent had gently suggested that it might be meaningful for Margaret to see the place one more time. Margaret had taken 3 days to decide. The care home was comfortable, her needs were met. She had her books and her garden views, and the twice-weekly visits from Claire that anchored her weeks. She'd thought she'd said her goodbyes to Havelock House already when she'd made the decision to sell it, had believed herself past the point of needing physical returns to physical places. But when she'd finally said yes to the visit, she'd known immediately that it was the right decision. Some things needed to be done in person, needed the body present in space rather than just the mind traveling through memory. Havelock House deserved more than to be sold without acknowledgement, without a proper leave-taking. Claire had the keys from the estate agent, and she unlocked the front door, while Margaret stood on the broad stone step and looked up at the facade. 3 years of emptiness had left their marks cobwebs in the corners of the windows, moss beginning to colonize the path between the garden beds, the general slightly forlorn quality of a house that knows itself to be unlived in. But the structure itself was solid, as it had always been. Great-grandfather Ellison had built well, had used good materials and good craftsmen, had created something designed to endure. Looking at it, Margaret felt a surge of something she couldn't quite name pride, perhaps, or gratitude, or simply the profound tenderness that comes from loving something long and deeply. "Ready?" Claire asked from the open doorway. Margaret took a breath of the October air, cool and smelling of fallen leaves and damp earth, and stepped inside. The hall smelled of emptiness. Not unpleasantly, there was no damp or decay. The house had been properly maintained during the vacancy, checked regularly by a property manager who'd ensured heating ran minimally and windows were occasionally opened. But there was an absence of the living smells that had characterized the house throughout her childhood and adult life, polish and cooking and fresh flowers and wood smoke, and the particular combination of scents that belonged to her parents, her husband, her children. Margaret stood in the hall and let her eyes move slowly over everything. The wallpaper, a William Morris design in green and cream that she and David had chosen together in 1971, was faded but intact. The broad staircase that rose to the first floor, its banister worn smooth by decades of hands, still had the slight creak on the fourth step that everyone who'd ever lived in the house had learned to step around or to step on deliberately, depending on whether you wanted to be noticed or not. The brass light fixture overhead had been there since before Margaret's time, a remnant of her parents' era, somewhat unfashionable, but so much a part of the house's identity that she'd never had the heart to replace it. She walked slowly to the foot of the staircase and put her hand on the newel post, a solid mahogany ball worn to a dark shine by more than a century of gripping hands. Her hand there, she thought, was one infinitesimal moment in a long sequence. Her great-grandfather's hand when the house was new, her grandmother's, her parents', her own through childhood and adulthood, her children's, her grandchildren's on Sunday visits when they'd hurtled up and down the stairs with the energy of children who don't yet understand that houses are finite, that family homes can be lost. "I'll just be here," Claire said from behind her, her voice carefully neutral, giving her mother space. "Take whatever time you need." Margaret moved left from the hall, toward the sitting room. This had been the formal room when she was a child, used for visitors and special occasions, where her mother had entertained with a certain formality that wasn't unkind, but was distinctly of its era. Afternoon tea with good china, careful conversation, her father sitting in the armchair by the window with his newspaper, occasionally looking over the top of it to observe visitors with the quiet assessment of a man who formed opinions slowly but firmly. The room was empty now of furniture. Most of it had been divided between Claire and her brother James when the house was put on the market. Some had gone to auction, some had been donated. The bare room looked larger than Margaret remembered it, the proportions of it more visible without the comfortable accumulation of furniture and objects that had always been there before. She walked to the window and looked out at the front garden. The garden had been her mother's great project, and then Margaret's own for 40 years of her life. She'd spent thousands of hours out there, planting and pruning and planting, learning from her mother's example and then developing her own sensibility. The garden showed 3 years of professional maintenance, tidy, but not particularly personal, kept functional but not loved in the way a garden needs to be loved to truly flourish. She could see the rose bed that ran along the south-facing wall, where her mother had grown the old-fashioned climbing varieties that bloomed once in June with extravagant generosity. Those roses were still there, she noticed, their canes tied back for winter, dormant now but carrying the potential of next summer's flowering. They'd been there for more than 80 years, those roses. They would still be there after Margaret was gone, after the new family had taken possession, probably after any of them could imagine. There was something comforting in that thought. The roses didn't know about ownership or family or the passage of generations. They simply grew, year after year, fulfilling their nature with indifference to the human dramas that played out around them. Margaret turned from the window and crossed to where the fireplace stood, the mantelpiece of white marble that had always seemed slightly too grand for the room's actual proportions. Above it, the pale rectangle on the faded wallpaper showed where a mirror had hung, the one piece of furniture that neither she nor the auction house had been able to place. She couldn't quite remember what had finally happened to it. Perhaps Claire would know. Her hand rested on the mantelpiece, and she remembered standing here as a child, on her tiptoes to reach this surface, examining the objects that lived there, a French clock that chimed the quarters, 2 Staffordshire figurines of shepherdesses that she'd loved with a child's uncritical devotion, a small oval-framed photograph of her parents on their wedding day in 1938. She'd looked at that, photographed thousands of times, had tried to reconcile the young, formal couple in their wedding clothes with the parents she knew, had wondered about who they'd been before they were her parents, about the private history that predated her existence. That photograph was in a box in her room at the care home now, one of the small collection of objects she'd taken with her when she moved. Her parents looked impossibly young in it, impossibly unformed, standing in the churchyard of this very village church, with expressions of careful seriousness that might have been gravity, or might have been the concentration required to stand still for the photographer. They'd have been 23 and 25. She was now 81. The mathematics of time never quite made sense when you looked at them directly. She moved through into the dining room, where the family had eaten together every evening throughout her childhood, where the table had been the geography of family life, her father at the head, her mother at the other end, her brother Richard across from her, the ritual of grace before meals, and the conversations that ranged from the mundane to the unexpectedly philosophical, according to her father's moods and her mother's gentle facilitation. Richard had died in 1987, a heart attack at 53 that had seemed brutally premature, and which had left Margaret with the particular grief of losing the only other person in the world who shared exactly her same memories of this house in childhood, who had eaten at this table every evening for 18 years, who would have understood without explanation the specific weight of standing in this empty room. She sat down on the floor, actually, which wasn't the most dignified thing for an 81-year-old woman to do, but which felt right. She sat cross-legged on the bare floorboards in the center of the room and let herself be small within it, the way she'd been small here as a child, looking up at the adults and their conversations, feeling simultaneously contained and safe. The floors were original. She noticed the wide pine boards that her father had sanded and sealed in the 1960s, now showing decades of use, scratched and marked in ways that recorded a kind of history. A dark stain near the window that might be from a wine glass dropped at some long-ago dinner party. The marks of furniture legs showing where the table and chairs had stood for 30 years, slightly indenting the soft wood. These marks were records. They were history written in a language that only the house could read. And this was, she thought, part of what she was doing here, reading the house before it could be read by someone else, before new occupants would begin to overwrite these marks with their own. She heard Claire moving quietly in the hall, being present without intruding, and felt a rush of love for her daughter that was almost painful in its intensity. Claire was 53 years old, the same age Richard had been when he died, and she was the thing Margaret was most grateful for in a long life that had contained many things to be grateful for. Not because Claire had been perfect, no child was, and Margaret had been a far from perfect mother, but because she had grown into a person of genuine kindness and intelligence, a person who understood that driving her elderly mother to Norfolk for a day's walk through an empty house was important, and who had simply done it without being asked twice. Margaret rose from the floor with some effort and continued her circuit of the ground floor. The kitchen last, she decided, saving it because it was the room that held the most. The library first, then her father's domain, the room where he'd kept his books and conducted his correspondence and retreated from family noise in the late evenings, where she'd been allowed to read alongside him on Sunday afternoons when she was old enough to be trusted with the books. He'd been a collector in a modest way, had loved the physical object of books as well as their contents, and his shelves had been well ordered and well curated. Those books had been among the hardest things to sort when the house was cleared. Family friends had taken some. The university library in Norwich had accepted others. Some had gone to charity shops. But they couldn't all be kept, and the empty shelves that remained were like absences more than presences, more noticeable for what they no longer held than for what they were in themselves. Margaret ran her fingers along one empty shelf, feeling the slight ridges left by years of book spines pressed against wood. Her father had read here every evening. He'd been a man who believed fundamentally in the importance of reading, who'd considered it something between a duty and a pleasure, who'd thought the examined life required regular engagement with the thoughts of others more experienced or wiser or more eloquent than oneself. She'd inherited that belief, had tried to pass it on to her own children with varying success. James read extensively, Claire less so, but with genuine engagement when she did. Her grandchildren were more complicated, some readers, some not, all of them navigating a world of so much competing content that the sustained attention required for books represented a genuine choice. The study was spare, with just the built-in shelves and the fireplace and the window that looked onto the side garden. No furniture remained, but the room had a quality of thoughtfulness, perhaps, or of accumulated attention that was more present than in the other rooms she'd walked through. This was where her father had thought, and somehow thinking left traces even in the absence of books and furniture and the man himself. He died in 1974, when Margaret was 35. Heart disease, as had Richard 13 years later, the family's particular vulnerability revealed. He'd been 61, which had seemed impossibly young to her at the time, though she was now more than 20 years older than he had been when he died, and understood that you could be old enough to leave behind genuine wisdom even at 61. She'd had 46 years without him now, more than half her life spent in his absence, and yet he was so present in this house, in every room she walked through. In the furniture she could still picture exactly where it had stood. In the garden he'd maintained with methodical weekly attention, and the particular quality of the light through these windows that she'd first understood through his eyes, watching him pause sometimes to simply look at a late afternoon illumination of the garden or a particular morning quality in the hall. The memory of her father was different from the memory of her mother, as different as the people themselves had been. Her mother lively and social and creative, the architect of the house's warmth and aesthetic, was present in the garden and in the sitting room, in the china patterns and the curtain fabrics, and the quality of attention that had been paid to beauty throughout. Her father was present in the library and in the evening quiet, in the sense that this had been a house where thinking was valued, where ideas were taken seriously, where learning was understood as pleasure rather than obligation. Margaret moved through into the conservatory, a Victorian addition at the back of the house that had always been her favorite room. Glass and iron, facing south, had caught the sun from mid-morning until late afternoon, and had been the warmest room in the house on winter days, a retreat from the cold that still retained the chill's beauty through the glass panes. Her mother had kept it filled with plants, tender things that couldn't survive the Norfolk winters outside, geraniums and fuchsias and a magnificent old clivia that had been passed down through the family for so long no one could trace its origins. Those plants were long gone now, most of them distributed to friends and neighbors when the house was cleared, some to the local garden center that had bought the better specimens. The clivia had gone to Claire, who'd reported it was thriving in her Bristol conservatory. But the structure remained, the distinctive iron frame and the particular quality of light through slightly wavy Victorian glass. Margaret sat in one of the 2 cast-iron chairs that had been left behind because they were too heavy and awkward to move easily, and she looked out at the garden through the familiar distortion of old glass. From here she could see the kitchen garden that had been her particular responsibility for 30 years, where she'd grown vegetables and cutting flowers and the soft fruits that had supplied the house with jams and cordials and pies through the summer and autumn. David had helped in his willing but unnatural way. He'd been a city person by background, had learned to appreciate gardens intellectually, but had never quite felt the visceral pull of soil and growing things that she'd inherited from her mother. David. She let herself think about him directly, which she sometimes didn't, which could still be difficult nearly 10 years after his death. They'd had 52 years together, almost precisely half her life. He'd come into Havelock House as a stranger, meeting her parents for the first time in 1964, with an earnest seriousness that she'd found touching, and he'd learned to love the house and to feel at home in it, though he'd always acknowledged that it was her house in a way it could never quite be his. He'd proposed in this conservatory, actually. She remembered the afternoon exactly. It had been late September. Her parents were away, the light at that angle coming through the wavy glass and falling across the stone flags. He'd been so nervous, which was unlike him, and she'd known for some time what he was going to say and had been waiting for him to say it with a patience she was rather proud of. She'd said yes immediately, and then they'd stood up and he'd knocked over the small table her mother kept the plant pots on, and they'd both laughed and her mother's geraniums had scattered across the floor, and they'd spent 20 minutes carefully repotting them before they could properly celebrate, and that had felt right, somehow, the laughter and the practical work of it, the engagement that began not with wine glasses and celebration, but with getting back on their knees to put spilled soil back in pots. 52 years. 2 children, 4 grandchildren, 3 houses, before they'd retired back to Havelock House when her parents were gone and the decision needed to be made about its future. David had been the one to suggest that they move here, that she'd never quite feel at home anywhere else, that Havelock House needed a proper family in it rather than being sold or let to strangers. He'd given up a city life he'd been comfortable in because he understood what the house meant to her, and she'd never forgotten that. Now, sitting in the conservatory, looking at the kitchen garden she'd tended for so many years, she thought about what the house had meant, not just to her, to all of them, to her parents who'd lived out the whole of their married life here, to Richard who'd grown up here and come back for visits until his death, always slightly awkward with his own urban life in London, but visibly relaxing the moment he turned into the drive, as if something loosened in him. To her children, for whom Havelock House had been the constant geography of childhood and holidays and family Christmases, and the particular importance of a place that holds you across many years. What was it about houses? Why did they hold meaning in this way? Why did they become repositories of identity and memory? Why did standing in an empty room that had once contained a life feel so different from standing in any other empty room? It was the accumulation, she thought. Not just personal memory, but something more than that. The sense of being embedded in a longer story, of being one link in a chain that had been forming for generations and would continue after you. The house had been built for her great-grandfather, passed to his son, who had left it to her parents, who had left it to her. Each generation had added to it and subtracted from it, had changed the wallpaper and repaired the roof and added the central heating in 1959 and renovated the kitchen in 1985. Each generation had loved it in their own way, according to their own lights. And now it was passing out of the family entirely, passing to strangers who would bring their own love and their own changes, who would make it mean something new, who would perhaps love it as thoroughly as any of them had loved it, though in entirely different ways. This had been the hardest part of the decision to sell. Not the practical losses, the rooms and the garden and the particular qualities of light, but the severance from the family narrative. Once it was sold, Havelock House would no longer be part of what the Ellisons were. Her grandchildren's children would have no claim on it, no relationship with it, no sense of it as part of their inheritance. The chain that her great-grandfather had begun in 1887 would simply end. But what was the alternative? Claire lived in Bristol with her own established life and home. James lived in Edinburgh. Neither had the means or the desire to maintain a large Victorian house in Norfolk. Her grandchildren were scattered London, New York, Melbourne, various addresses that reflected the mobility of their generation. There was no one to inherit Havelock House in any meaningful sense. And perhaps that was all right. Perhaps the house had served its purpose, had done the work that houses do, providing shelter and continuity and the physical geography for several generations of living, and now it would begin a new chapter with a new family. The meaning it held for the Ellisons would continue in their memories and their stories and the qualities it had given to them, even if the physical structure belonged to someone else. This was what she'd come here to understand, she thought, not to prevent the sale or to second-guess the decision, but to complete it properly, to walk through the rooms and acknowledge what they'd meant, to say goodbye consciously rather than letting the sale happen at a distance through paperwork and legal processes that made it abstract and bloodless. She rose from the iron chair and walked into the kitchen. The kitchen was where she'd expected to feel it most, and she was right. The kitchen was the heart of Havelock House, had been the heart of it throughout her entire life and beyond. Large and north-facing, with a flagstone floor that was always slightly cool underfoot even in summer. It ran the full width of the back of the house and looked out through a wide window onto the kitchen garden. Her mother had cooked here every day for 30 years, producing the meals that fed the family through all its seasons and occasions. Margaret had learned to cook here, watching and then doing, learning the particular traditions of the house's food, the Sunday roasts and the Saturday baking, and the summer preservation of fruit and the autumn production of sloe gin and hedgerow jellies that had been her mother's particular pride. The kitchen still retained its essential character, even empty. The Aga that dominated the north wall coal-fired in her childhood, converted to oil sometime in the 1970s, was no longer there, having been removed for the sale, but the alcove it had occupied was still blackened at the back, and the warmth that the kitchen had always had, that particular quality of a room built around a heat source, still seemed to linger even without it. The dresser was gone too, the great oak piece that had held the family's china and the accumulated decorative objects of 3 generations. The dresser's absence left a ghost on the wall behind it, a rectangle of slightly darker paint where it had stood for perhaps 80 years, protected from light and air, preserving the original color, while everything around it faded. Margaret traced the edge of this ghost rectangle with one finger. Her grandmother had bought that dresser new. It had held the same china for decades, the blue and white spode that had been her mother's everyday china and which had been divided between her children when the house was cleared. She had 3 of the serving plates in her room at the care home, impractical as large plates in a care home room, but impossible to part with. Her daughter had the rest. The kitchen table had stood in the center of the room, the large one that could seat 8 comfortably, and had seated 12 at Christmas if people were willing to be slightly cramped. That table solid oak, scarred by years of use, one end darker than the other from a spill of something that had stained the wood deeply before anyone noticed, had been where everything had happened, where homework was done and newspapers read and family arguments had played out over meals, and where she had sat at 2 in the morning when her children were babies, and the nights were long feeding them in the quiet of the house, while the rest of the world slept. She'd been happy in this kitchen. The thought arrived with a simplicity that caught her off guard. Not always, not every moment, not without the difficulties and sorrows and frustrations that constituted a life fully lived, but fundamentally, genuinely, in a way that she understood only in retrospect. She'd been happy here, in this house, in this kitchen, in this family life that the house had contained and shaped. The window above the sink looked onto the kitchen garden, and she stood there for a long while, looking at the garden in its autumn state, the cleared beds, the bare fruit bushes, the last of the fallen leaves blowing against a low wall her father had built sometime in the 1960s, the wall she'd helped him build in some small way as a child, carrying the stones he cut and placed. She could see him, almost, in the garden, a slightly formal man in his working clothes, proceeding with the methodical attention he brought to everything, measuring and cutting stone, consulting the level to ensure the wall was true. She'd been perhaps 9 or 10. She'd worn, for some reason she couldn't account for, a particular green cardigan that she could still see clearly. They'd worked in companionable silence mostly, the kind of silence that was its own form of conversation, that said, "I enjoy being with you," without requiring the complication of words. That wall was still there. The new family would inherit it without knowing the man who'd built it or the child who'd helped, would simply have a good stone wall in their kitchen garden that they'd maintain or alter or perhaps pull down someday without thinking about what it had meant, how it had been made, whose hands had shaped it. This was the nature of things. Every house contained accumulated labor and love that its occupants would never know about, an archaeology of attention and care deposited layer by layer over generations, invisible to those who came after. She didn't know who had planted the oak that grew at the corner of the property, planted perhaps 200 years ago, now enormous and magnificent. She didn't know who had laid the original garden walls, who had installed the original sash windows, who had lived in the house before her great-grandfather had built the current structure on an older foundation. And those people had been real, had had their own loves and losses and moments of happiness in the specific qualities of this specific light. had stood at this window, perhaps, watching their own versions of this garden. There was a continuity in that, a comfort in the idea that the house had held many lives and would hold many more, that the meaning she and her family had found here was not the only meaning or the final meaning, but one chapter in a much longer story that predated her and would outlast her. She moved to the back door and stood with her hand on the old latch, the same latch she'd worked thousands of times, its shape worn smooth and familiar by all those hands. She stood there not opening it yet, just holding it, feeling the cool brass under her palm. What had she come here to find, exactly? Not to recapture what was lost that was impossible, and she understood the impossibility clearly enough that she'd never quite fallen into the trap of believing it. Not to make peace with the sale, she'd made that peace already, as clearly as one could make peace with something that still hurt. Not to say goodbye, quite, because goodbye implied a finality that she wasn't sure she believed in with regard to places that had shaped you. Perhaps she'd come to acknowledge. To stand in these rooms and acknowledge that they had mattered, that the life lived here had been real and significant, that the people who'd inhabited these rooms had been fully and gloriously themselves within these walls. To acknowledge that something real was ending, even while understanding that something real would continue in her memories, in her children's memories, in the changed people she and her family had become partly as a result of having grown up here. She lifted the latch and went out into the kitchen garden. The air was cooler here, the afternoon already beginning its decline toward early darkness. The soil of the raised beds smelled of autumn damp earth and decay, and the promise of spring underneath. She walked the paths slowly between the empty beds, looking at the shapes of things that had fed her family through many years. Here, the asparagus bed, the crowns she'd planted in her first year in sole charge of the garden, 20-odd years after David had died, the bed that needed years before it produced, and which had finally become the most reliable pleasure of late spring. There, the raised beds for soft fruit, the gooseberries and currants that had made jams and fools and summer puddings every year. Against the south wall, the espaliered apple trees her father had planted, and she had maintained their bare winter skeletons elegant against the old brick. She stopped in front of one of the apple trees and put her hand against its bark. The tree was perhaps 60 years old, had been a sapling when she was a teenager, was now thick-trunked and substantial, its branches extending in the carefully trained pattern her father had established, and she had maintained. It had fruited every autumn of its existence, had been part of the house's supply of apples through all those decades. Next autumn it would fruit for the new family. They wouldn't know its age or its history. They would simply find an apple tree in their garden, bearing fruit, and they would eat those apples, or make them into things, and the tree would continue its annual productivity without reference to the human stories that had surrounded it. Margaret thought about the new family a couple, she understood, with 2 young children. She tried to imagine them in this kitchen garden, the children excited by the novelty of fruit from their own trees, the parents learning gradually what the garden required, making mistakes she had also made, discovering in time what she had discovered, that the garden was one of the genuinely reliable pleasures, that it returned to you roughly in proportion to what you gave it, that its seasonal rhythms were a form of wisdom you couldn't learn from books, but only from years of attention. She hoped they would love it. She hoped the children would grow up knowing the names of the trees and the locations of the soft fruit beds, that they would eat strawberries from this garden in June with the specific pleasure that comes from eating something you've grown yourself, that one of them would become the gardener she'd been, and her mother before her, carrying on the accumulated knowledge of this particular piece of ground. That was the other thing you gave away when you sold a house, the particular knowledge of it. She knew this garden in ways that were almost physical, in a way that went beyond intellectual knowledge into something more like bodily memory. She knew where the soil was better in one corner than another, knew which bed got the most afternoon sun, knew the particular behavior of the east wall in a wet season, knew the microclimate variations that made some things thrive here that wouldn't have thrived 3 feet away. All that knowledge would be lost when she left today, would have to be relearned by the new family from scratch, through their own years of attention. There was no way to transfer it, no manual she could write that would capture the 1,000 small observations that added up to knowing a garden. They would have to learn it the same way she had learned it, by being here, by paying attention, by the slow accumulation of seasons. She walked back through the kitchen garden and re-entered the house, latching the back door behind her. She found Claire in the kitchen, standing at the window, looking out at the garden, having evidently watched Margaret's circuit of the beds. "The asparagus is looking good," Claire said. "The crowns look healthy. It should do well for them next spring," Margaret said. The bed is well established now. They stood together in the empty kitchen for a moment, mother and daughter, in a house that had held them both through different chapters of their lives. Claire had been born in 1971, the year the William Morris wallpaper had been put up in the sitting room. She'd grown up in this house as Margaret had grown up in it, had cooked in this kitchen as Margaret had cooked in it, had stood at this window looking at this garden as Margaret had stood at it her whole adult life. The house was part of Claire, too. This visit wasn't only for Margaret's benefit, Sarah realized, or rather, Margaret realized, understanding something she hadn't quite consciously considered. It was for both of them. Claire needed to be here, too, needed her own leave-taking, her own acknowledgement. "Do you want to look around?" Margaret asked. "We have time." Claire was quiet for a moment. "I walked through while you were in the garden." "I hope that's all right." "Of course. I sat in my old bedroom for a while." Claire's voice had the careful evenness of someone maintaining composure. It looked so different, empty, smaller somehow. "I spent so many hours in that room, the world felt very large from there." "Where do you think I was in this house?" Margaret said. "When I was your age? When you were small? In the evenings when you were in bed, where do you think I was?" Claire considered. "Here, mostly." "In this kitchen?" "Yes. Sitting at the table with a book or a glass of wine, listening for sounds from upstairs. This kitchen was where I lived for years. And now it's empty, and that's right, and it should be. But I'm glad I came to see it once more." They stood together quietly for another moment. Then Claire said, "Shall we do upstairs?" They climbed the staircase together, Margaret's hand on the banister, feeling the 4th step creak under their feet. The landing was lighter than the ground floor, the south-facing window letting in the afternoon sun at an angle that illuminated the dust motes floating in the undisturbed air. The main bedroom, first her parents' room, then hers and David's, large and square with original cornicing and a view of the front garden and the lane beyond. Empty, it looked like a room from history, its bones visible without the covering of furniture and life. The corner where her parents had always had their wardrobe. The window where she'd sat on the wide sill as a child, reading for hours, watching the lane below for the returning cars of visiting relatives. David had died in this room. In hospital would have been the practical choice, the sensible choice, and the doctors had suggested it more than once. But he'd been very clear about wanting to be here, had been almost peaceful about it, and they'd arranged the nursing care required. And he died in this room on a November morning in 2015 with the garden visible through the window, the way he'd wanted. She wasn't sure what she'd expected to feel, standing in this empty room with that knowledge. Grief, perhaps, or the particular variety of grief that comes from spatial memory. But what she felt was more complicated and ultimately more peaceful than grief, a sense of his presence that was different from the absence she'd mostly been living with for 10 years. He'd been here. This room knew him. And even empty, even passing to strangers, that was something. She stood at the window for a moment, looking at the lane and the fields beyond, and thought about the morning he'd died, and about the 52 years that had preceded it, and about how inadequate the word marriage was for what they'd had, not inadequate as a category, but inadequate as a descriptor, too small a word for something that had in practice been everything: companion, argument, support, irritation, love expressed in 10,000 daily forms, two people becoming, over decades, genuinely fluent in each other. "Mom?" Claire from the doorway. Gentle. "Yes, I'm all right," Margaret said, though she hadn't been asked that exactly. "I'm all right." They looked at Claire's old bedroom, the smaller room at the back, overlooking the kitchen garden, which she'd preferred as a teenager because it was further from her parents' room and permitted a sense of privacy and independence. James's room at the front, larger, which he'd always considered a point of ongoing injustice, though in truth he'd preferred it and had known it. The bathroom with the original Victorian tiles that had required constant vigilance about the grouting, but which were genuinely beautiful, geometric in cream and dark blue. The small box room at the end of the corridor that had been used for storage throughout Margaret's childhood, but which she'd converted into a proper spare bedroom in the 1990s, when the grandchildren started coming and there was suddenly a need for more sleeping spaces. That room held the memory of grandchildren sleeping, a particular kind of memory, warm and slightly exhausted, the good tiredness of having provided for people you loved. They came back downstairs without speaking much, had reached something beyond the need for words. In the hall, Margaret stood one more time at the foot of the staircase, her hand on the newel post, and looked up at the staircase rising to the first floor, and thought about all the feet that had climbed it, all the hands that had held this banister, all the nights and mornings that had been punctuated by the specific creak of the fourth step. She was the last of the family to be in this house, she thought. After today, no one who'd grown up here would walk these halls again. The new family would make it theirs, would layer their lives over the previous layers, would fill it with their own sounds and smells and accumulations. And perhaps someday one of their children or grandchildren would stand in this hall and feel what she felt now, the weight of accumulated time, the presence of the past, the particular quality of a house that has been genuinely lived in. The house would hold them as it had held her. That was what houses did. That was their purpose and their gift, to hold the people who lived within them, to give human lives a physical form, to create the geography within which the interior work of living could happen. "Ready?" Claire asked from beside her, and this time the word carried a different weight than when she'd asked it at the beginning. Margaret took a breath. The house was quiet around them, afternoon light falling through the hall windows, in the particular way she'd been seeing it her whole life, the dust motes turning slowly in the slanted illumination. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." They left through the front door, and Claire locked it behind them, and Margaret stood on the stone step and looked at the facade one last time. The cream render, the tall windows, the slate roof, the garden beyond the gate, and its autumn quietness. She'd thought she would feel terrible at this moment. She'd anticipated a kind of grief that would require managing, a loss that would need to be contained to get through the day. But what she actually felt was something quieter and stranger than that, a fullness almost, a sense of completion rather than truncation. She'd been here. She'd walked through the rooms and remembered. She'd stood in the kitchen garden and touched the bark of a tree her father had planted. She'd sat in the conservatory and remembered the afternoon David had proposed, the spilled geraniums, the laughter. She'd stood in the room where he'd died and felt his presence rather than only his absence. The house had given her what houses give, the sense that the past was real, that the people who were gone had genuinely existed, that the life she'd lived had been worth living, that it had mattered, that she had been known and loved in these rooms, had known and loved in return, had been part of something that would persist even after she was gone, in her children's memories, in her grandchildren's characters, in the changed people that the accumulation of this house and this family had made them. She turned to Claire. "Thank you for bringing me. Thank you for letting me come," Claire said. "I needed this too." They walked to the car, and Claire held the door for her mother, and Margaret settled into the passenger seat and looked through the window at the house as Claire came around and got in, started the engine, began to turn around in the lane. As they pulled away, Margaret watched Havelock House through the window, watching it as the lane curved and the house disappeared behind the hedge and then was gone. She faced forward then, and the lane wound through the fields toward the main road, and the afternoon light was golden on the autumn fields, and Claire drove carefully, and the radio was off, and they moved through the quiet countryside in a silence that was not sad, but was instead something more complex and richer than sadness, the silence of two people who have shared something that doesn't need words, who have done something important together and know it, who are carrying the same thing home. Margaret thought about what it meant to remember, really remember, with your whole body and not just your mind. She'd been in the rooms, had stood in the spaces, had put her hands on the surfaces, and the memories that had come hadn't been like looking at photographs, had been more immediate than that, more physical, more like turning the pages of a book you'd actually lived through than like looking at a record of someone else's story. She'd been 7 years old, running down those stairs on Christmas morning. She'd been 19, coming home from her first year at university, climbing those stairs with the complicated feelings of someone who's changed and is returning to a place that hasn't. She'd been 26, standing at the kitchen window and watching her father in the garden, and feeling, obscurely, that she was watching something that would someday end and should be noticed. She'd been 35, in the kitchen at midnight with a baby that wouldn't sleep, feeling simultaneously trapped and fiercely in love with the small, demanding creature in her arms. She'd been 51, sitting in the conservatory after her mother's funeral, understanding for the first time what it meant to be the older generation, to have no one above you anymore, to be the one who would be remembered rather than the one who remembered. All of those selves had been real. All of those moments had been real, had been occurring in the actual world had left their traces in the house, and in her and in the people around her. And now they were memory, which was different from being past memory, was alive, was present, was part of what she carried, and would always carry. She had not lost the house, she thought. You can't lose something that has become part of you. The house was in her hand's knowledge of the new post, in her feet's knowledge of the fourth stair, in her eyes' knowledge of the way afternoon light moved through those particular windows at this time of year. It was in her muscles and her bone memory, in the dreams she'd sometimes had and sometimes still had of walking those rooms, in the 10,000 daily habits that had been formed in relation to that specific space. She was, in some important sense, made of that house, made of the experience of it, of the years of living within it, of the people she'd been with and the people she'd become in relation to it. That couldn't be taken away, couldn't be sold to a young family from London along with the property and the fixtures and fittings. What she was leaving behind was the physical structure and the right to enter it and the responsibility for it. And these were significant losses, genuinely. She would miss the garden in spring when the fruit trees bloomed. She would miss the kitchen on winter mornings. She would miss, in an abstract way, the knowledge that the house existed in the world with her family's claim upon it. But she was not leaving behind what the house had given her, which was everything that had happened within it, everything that had been shaped by it, everyone who had been loved and known and raised and mourned within its walls. That was hers inalienably, permanently, until her own end, and in whatever persisted after. The Norfolk lanes gave way to the A road, and then the motorway, and they were on their way back to Bristol, to the care home, to the ordered and diminished but genuinely comfortable life she was living now. Claire put on the radio softly, and Margaret watched the darkening countryside flow past the windows, and thought about nothing in particular for a long time. Then she said, quietly, "I'm glad we went." Claire glanced at her. "So am I." They drove on into the evening, into the ordinary traffic of the motorway, into the comfortable familiar rhythms of a relationship built over half a century, mother and daughter carrying their shared day home through the dark, the house behind them and inside them at once, the past not gone but changed into something she could carry, something made to last.